This is Fusion Capitalism, a clean energy vision for conservatives. Brought to you by industry leader and company CEO, Steve Melink. Here's Steve.
Welcome back to my discussion with Tom Fanning, the chairman, president, and CEO of Southern Company, the country's second largest utility company. Tom, in your mind, with the technologies that are available off the shelf today, are we able to get to the goal of zero carbon, or do we need to develop new technologies to get us to the finish line?
So there's a glib answer to that and a little more thorough answer. The glib answer is yes, it can. The more thorough answer goes to this. If we can solve these other policy issues, can we find people to essentially reconstruct this nation's energy complex in this time frame? So let's say it's 15 years to 2035, or let's say it's 25 years or whatever it is beyond that. Will the people exist, skilled labor exist to be able to do this enormous construction effort? For Southern Company, as big as we are, to get to net zero, it would represent somewhere around 3 times the capital deployment of any other similar period in our history. 3 times. Where will we get the workforce to do that? 2, we have terrible issues in our global supply chain. Where are we going to solve the problems? And I think, frankly, this problem is an opportunity for America to repatriate manufacturing capability for turbines and for transmission towers and generators and all sorts of things. We can't rely on other nations and the bottlenecks that invariably occur to feed that monster. We've got to get more skilled labor. We've got to repatriate our manufacturing capability. Those are great, big issues we need to address as a nation. If we can get that spoken for, the next challenge is going to be, how do we make this affordable? From my work at the Fed, we know that the economic recovery was really benefiting kind of the top third of the nation's population, and really the bottom 2/3, certainly the bottom half, didn't really enjoy the same benefits of recovery. It's going to cost nearly 50% price increases in order to get to net zero. Forget inflation and everything else. How do we adopt an economic and energy policy where we rise all boats? That's going to be another big challenge, and it needs to be very thoughtfully done over time.
Agreed. I've read that the U.S. may need 200% more electric generation capacity for the growing EV market within the next 10 years, and 100% more capacity for the growing heat pump market needed to replace gas-fired furnaces and water heaters. Therefore, that would suggest our grid needs to grow by about 3 times over and above where it is now, without even accounting for normal economic growth. Does that jive with your understanding?
In my opinion, who knows is really the answer, right? But in my opinion, those numbers are a little high. And if you adopt technologies that are able to be located near the load centers, you won't need to have to expand the grid as much as you suggest. The crazy thing about wind, and please understand, I'm a fan of wind. I like it. I just recognize this reality. If you look at a map of the great wind resources in America, they are generally located where there are no people. And so therefore, the challenge on wind is always to build this enormous grid infrastructure to move it from where the wind resource is to where the people are. That is poor electricity design, and frankly, increases the vulnerability of the grid to people that have adverse interests to America, and also increases your vulnerability to crazy things like hurricanes and tornadoes and all kinds of things. Is it going to be as high as you suggest? I don't know. The other thing that I would argue is going to work in your favor is energy efficiency. I think that technology innovation space will continue to grow. Look, I think energy, especially electricity, will grow over time. I think there will be innovations along the way that reduce the burden that you suggest a wee bit in that data.
I see. As you know, Tom, Congress is reviewing an infrastructure bill and reconciliation bill that appear to have climate provisions in both. What do you hope will come from these two bills from a utility standpoint?
Well, number one, I'll call out specifically the Wyden tax bill has lots of good things. It is technology kind of agnostic with respect to providing tax benefits to promote innovation in the grid and in the generation capability of America. So that's all good. The other idea that I keep saying to folks in Washington, and I walk the halls a pretty good bit, is the idea that we've got to provide incentives, carrots, not just sticks, to get this done. Let me just give you our own experience. Southern Company set in place, I think we were like the first utility or whatever, one of the first, to go net zero by 2050. And then we set an interim goal of 50% reduction by 2030. We accomplished that goal a decade early, just because of a constructive regulatory environment, just because of our own reach, I think, into research, development, and technology innovation. And we've done that at a price to customers that has been great. A lot of a knee-jerk reaction among policymakers in Washington is to use the regulatory stick to penalize people that don't make the progress they should make. What we have to understand is that via the Federal Power Act in America, we have intentionally, as a matter of big policy, pushed a lot of these decisions down to the states. And in fact, just more examples of why it can work in a constructive way without kind of this onerous regulation. The state of Georgia, Alabama, our southeast states have never had a renewable portfolio standard requirement, okay? Mm-hmm. Have never had it. And yet, our biggest subsidiary, Georgia Power Company, was named by the solar industry itself the top investor-owned utility in the solar space idea. We've never had a requirement to hit a goal. We hit goals because they made sense for customers, and we move quickly in that regard. So when I think about policy in Washington, there's been a great debate about the best way to do it. Let's make sure that we provide incentives along the way and not just penalizing regulation to get us there. And in fact, one of the kind of other phrases I use with policymakers now is that you got to get in the boat with us. If we're going to move this big, this fast, get in the boat with us. Don't have this arm's length regulatory approach to solving problems. You know, and one last thing I'll just say, and I've said this a lot in the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and the whole way to think about reimagining national defense with the private sector leaning in, is that if it is solely a regulatory approach, that breeds a compliance reaction by private industry. It breeds almost a defensive approach to making sure we don't get penalized. That is absolutely the incorrect way to think about broad, wide-scale, fast solutions by the private sector to solve problems. Let's reimagine this idea about positive ways, incentives to reach the goals that are important for all Americans.
Okay, so specifically, you're for tax credits, say, but against a carbon tax. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, broadly. But I like a carbon tax better than a trading system, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. And there's ways you can make a carbon tax less onerous. In other words, and I'm a little skeptical of this, please understand, but I wouldn't mind you tell me, $50 price per ton on carbon emissions. If you could capture those revenues and then redistribute them to customers so that it becomes affordable.
Sure.
Now, you don't have to have a carbon tax to do that. Southern Company already implies in our integrated resource planning processes an implied cost of carbon. Now, ours goes up to, I guess, at the high end, $20, and we've just started a $50 scenario. And we go through all sorts of probability-weighted planning processes where we come up with dominant solutions to meet the needs of the future. We imply a cost of carbon, but there is no carbon tax. And so therefore, you don't use this sledgehammer on the economy. We don't need more taxes in our energy complex. That is adverse to economic growth, but it's a good signal. Mm-hmm. So can we have an implied signal that accomplishes the same thing? Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay. And what is your feeling on policy coming from at the federal level versus the state level? Do you favor more of one versus the other? And is there are we missing something by not having a national grid that can more easily transport the electricity from the wind farms to other places like maybe the Southeast?
Well, remember, I think there's a certain amount of long-haul transmission that makes sense, but if you are wed to that, you are making yourselves way riskier and more vulnerable. Please understand that is not a free lunch. Federal versus state. Ernie Moniz is on my board. He was energy secretary under, I guess, Obama. And I've worked with him, like I said, 25 years or so. I've always had this idea that I would love a clear national energy policy. If you want to look something up, remember when Waxman-Markey was proposed out of Congress? It never made it to the light of day, but it was something we were preparing for in order to achieve certain carbon objectives. Oh, by the way, we beat the requirements of Waxman-Markey on our own without the law, as an aside. Mm-hmm. But if there was a real national energy policy that said, I want you to reach carbon net zero by such and such a year, there would be a response. You can look this up, Google it up if you want. EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, had a response called PRISM and then PRISM 2.0. The one I would direct you to is PRISM 2.0. It was a regional approach, rational, that took into account not only the growth of renewables and conventional sources of energy and transmission. It is a great kind of model for what a real national energy policy may end up being. There is lots of friction in the federal government where you have gas pipelines regulated by people outside the Department of Energy. We could debate that one all day long. But if you could construct a federal objective and then let the states implement it, then I think you may get the best of both outcomes. You cannot have the federal government ride over the states. The states have an appropriate place to regulate and implement national policy at the local level.
Okay, very good. This was going to be my last question, and I thought I was going to have a got you in a way, because this is how it goes. 3 scientists were just awarded the Nobel Prize for their contributions on climate modeling. And while it's important to recognize scientists, economists, and politicians for such thought leadership, to stem the worst of climate change, we also need business leaders to engineer, manufacture, and construct our way out of this climate problem. Therefore, the utility industry can do more good or more harm, at least in my opinion, than any single industry when it comes to climate change. My question is, if it meant saving the world, raising Southern's brand and stature as the number one global energy leader, and you being awarded the Nobel Prize, would you consider moving up your zero carbon goal from 2050 to 2040? And before I even got to that question, you've already said that you're going to maybe even get there by 2035, just depending on...
Hey, look, I don't need the Nobel Prize. I need to get home safely at night. We're doing that anyway. That's a piece of cake.
That's fantastic, Tom.
You know, all these models and all this other stuff. One time at Georgia Tech, I was a math major, and you get into things like chaos theory and all that. If chaos theory teaches us anything, is that the variance in nature is always bigger than what we measure. And I think we're seeing that. What we have to do in the steps we take in the next few years and decades, even after I'm gone, is recognize that these unintended consequences and variable outcomes will always be there. You know, people always talk about these black swans, these 1 in 100 year events. I always love showing my management team here that black swans occur every year. And the unintended consequences of that are enormous. And so you always must have in your mind this idea that determinative steps we take are never enough. And we always have to plan for and implement robust ideas and plans that are adaptable and can change with changing environments. I think we absolutely are that way with climate. And that's why I've always been a big believer in, technology innovation and what we can do to create optionality in our energy future.
Well, I guess my last question now is going to be, who's going to win the football game between University of Georgia and the Cincinnati Bearcats when they come to meet in the playoffs?
Now
I'm from Cincinnati.
Are you really? So
Yes.
It's so funny. This is the second time I've been asked that this week. Here's the thing. I'm a Georgia Tech guy, so I am no fan of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
The mascot of Georgia is an English bulldog, right? I have an English bulldog, but his name is Buzz, which is the name of the Georgia Tech mascot.
I see.
Georgia wins by 2 touchdowns.
Okay. All right. Well, love your optimism there, Tom. And anyway, it's been a great conversation. Thank you for your time and for your leadership in the energy industry.
Steve, thanks you for getting the message out. We appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Fusion Capitalism. To find out more about Steve Melink and his book, go to fusioncapitalism.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.